All right, that's got to be a little hint that they're not actually gone, right? I'm surprised to not get a reunion scene though with the other cats. I would have expected that. To be fair, I don't know. Games post-credit scenes, it's a possibility. Um, but yeah, that's Stray. So for those who haven't been here before, when I finish a game, I always have the credits roll on stream. I'm a firm believer in give credit where credit's due. And then I'll take this time to kind of reflect on the game. Not so much a review, but just like my first feelings coming out of it. Right, Jack? Yeah, they were. I mean, all the trash talk was too much. We're not going back. No. But I expected it, if nothing else, for that emotional like reunion moment. But they also don't give you a ton of investment being with the other cats at the beginning. They give you a little bit. So I can understand them not having to necessarily go with like a payoff at the end. In terms of like the gameplay and all that, I think it's pretty well designed. I think they made the right choice actually to not let you control the manual platforming. You feel much more like a cat in that sense, because I realized as I was going through, I'm like, you know, if I had a jump button everywhere, it would start to feel like a little ridiculous, a little video gamey to me at least. So the predetermined pathways I think is fine. Another game that I absolutely adore, Enslaved, did something similar with its climbing mechanics back in the day. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, honestly. In terms of the story, I do like it overall. I love that the way they approach that thematic like sacrifice at the end. Again, I make a comparison to the I Am Legend book as opposed to like the films, because it's much more of that like you're going through what humanity created and discovering, in a sense, all the cats. Oh, and there's a few pups. Okay, they got both of the pets in the credits. And I think this is much more of the thematic of like what humanity has done, and that even the companions are caught up in that cycle. And so he effectively sacrifices himself, or seemingly sacrifices himself, because I think that little blip on the screens there seems to imply that his consciousness is back in the system. I really like that. I love that they use that approach. And I think it does also kind of confirm what I was thinking once we got the reveal about B12 and who B12 actually is. That, yeah, that was the only human consciousness left in that sense. The companions actually evolved. And they mimic their creators in doing so. I think the only thing that I would really criticize the story for actually is the B12, like, I don't think that they set that up in a way where it's a very like meaningful payoff. And part of the reason I say that is, and Jack, I know you've only seen me play like a few things, but I'm generally not one to try and like unravel what's going on in a story, or guess at it. I love letting it take me for a ride, right? So for me, if I figure something out or guess at something in a game, that's usually not a good sign for me, because it feels like, oh, the writing was so obvious, or it was so much like, hey, this is up in your face or on the wall, that even I, you know, trying not to let myself look for things, spotted it, right? Now, the certainty of that, I think they do a good job not addressing it directly, but letting it just kind of flow from there. So I will say, I think they handled that part of it pretty well. I was actually kind of expecting a bit more on that end in terms of like answers to some of those questions. But I understand going with a streamlined narrative as opposed to something that's like super complex. And it definitely, you know, playing through it as a cat gives you a different feeling. Anyone who's ever owned a pet, I mean, that end there of like, you were such a good friend. I mean, immediately, like, I look over at my dog and it's that feeling of, yeah, that companionship, that friendship, but, you know, doing it with a cat and a robot instead, is a pretty good approach. I understand why so many people fell in love with this playing it, but I do think there's just a little bit there with the writing and how they set some of that up scenario-wise that probably could have been done a little better to make it a little bit of a bigger punch. Yeah, and that's a good point, Jack. I don't know that predictability is ever a mark of bad writing. I didn't mean to say that. For me, it's more so if you're because I think where the line for like my experiences and where it feels good is it something though that's telegraphing it in a way, but then tries to act like it's a surprise, right? Because you're kind of sharing this dual perspective of the cat as the player and then B12 regaining memories. And I don't know how they would do it. Like I think that's the other part of this, right? Is like just I can't quite pin down why it felt so like predictable to me in that sense. And too predictable. Like it's I think that's always going to be at the heart of what does the audience know that the person there doesn't? And if you try to make the audience as blind as the person who makes the discovery, there's always a thin line there, right? Of like, oh, well, you can figure it out. And yeah, it just, I don't know. It felt like they were trying to treat it as more of a mystery than they were setting up. I think that's where that kind of comes in a little bit of that feeling of, you try to make this seem like a big mystery and reveal, but the setup for that isn't really doing that. Like, I think that's what I think they needed a little more setup in that sense. I don't know though. Like, if you're playing as just the cat, there's no context at all, right? And I have no problem with that. The comparison that I'd make for that actually is Blade Runner. So Blade Runner famously has about 8 billion different versions of it, but the primary difference between a lot of the cuts of Blade Runner has to do with the narration. And my argument has always been, you know, a lot of people prefer the later cuts because the narration from Harrison Ford is gone. And I don't, for one simple reason, right? I think for a lot of people, when they go and watch that, if you're watching Blade Runner for the very first time, I think you lose too much context and too much backstory without the narration. Now, if you're watching it on a repeat viewing, it feels unnecessary, right? Like, and I think that's where that opinion ends up, or at least to me, that seems to be the explanation that I've always thought of for the opinion people have on preferring the non-narrated version is you've already gained the information from the narration from seeing it once before. You can't like take that out of your mind, and I think that's where, in a similar sense, if Stray was just you as the cat, what would you convey then in your playing through, right? The whole language of the game would have to change, or are you going to just like explain that the cat understands all of the robots and the language and stuff? Like it learns? Is it a smarter cat than like a normal cat? At that point, I feel like you're probably just making a different narrative. I don't know that you're really going with this here, especially not the thematic ending of the, you know, quote unquote last human sacrificing themselves for what comes next. It's a completely different story. And yeah, and honestly, I think that's what Stray is ultimately. It's a human tale being told, you know, using the avatar of a cat, essentially. It's similar. I mean, in that sense, they came out on the same day, so it's kind of funny. But in that sense, I think it's where like Endling and Stray, they're both trying to tell human narratives or human-driven narratives about what we've done, about what we're doing now, and about like the consequences of that moving forward. They reach very different conclusions around that, right? Stray is more of the humans or human recognizing that, passing it on then to the life that comes after. Whereas Endling is more about the fact that you're dragging everything down, including the life that would come after. So it's funny that they came out on the same day. They touch on that in very similar ways of you playing as an animal, one directly affected by all this, and one a little bit more indirectly in Stray's case. Between the two, honestly, I'd have to say I still actually think Endling is the one that I prefer more. I think the way it tells its narrative, I think the way you uncover things, is really, really good and really overlooked. That loop, honestly. Yeah, I mean, it's and that's why I say it's one of those instances. Anytime you deal with science fiction, really good science fiction can, in retrospect, start to feel like, oh, they were in on what was happening, right? Like it's so believable in its premise. And those creatures, I just started calling them Zergs, but I think the actual name was Zerks. Yeah, the idea that we could lead to these organisms that would not only be our downfall, but also be the downfall of life that comes after us. And then especially the fact that it was really as simple as, if you're going to defeat those things, just open it up again. Go back out into the world. Go back out into nature. It's it's cautionary tales in games. So overall, I like Stray. I do think there's a few little nitpicks with movement and camera, but that happens with any games like this. I don't think they really are that bad. I do like the traversal system. I actually think that was a smart choice. I can understand why they went away from a free jump system. But I think there's a few narrative weaknesses in the setup that would keep me from, like, I know there's been some talk of like, oh, Stray in that like top games of the year category, and it's certainly one of the better ones. But I don't know that this would be something that would be a game of the year candidate for me. One thing to keep in mind with that, and I think this is a very big caveat with games like this, right? It would be very easy to boil it down to Stray has cats. I like cats, but I'm not a cat person. I'm a dog person. So there's going to be a different type of attachment to that, right? Whereas opposed to a game like Endling, I am a huge fox person. I absolutely adore foxes. It's one of the reasons why they're the Kitsune fox masks in my logo. So automatically, right? Like I have to recognize if you're telling narratives with either of these animals, one of them is going to pull me in more. Compared to the other. Now that doesn't mean that it gets to just right off of that and that's it. The quality of what follows comes into play. But yeah, I don't know that I would put it in that top 10 for the year. Definitely. That said, I haven't actually played a lot of new releases this year. I'm trying to play things as they come out more. Hence South of the Circle and Endling and Stray. There was something else I played right as it launched. I can't remember now. I'm going to be playing Roller Drone when it comes out next month. Oh, I cannot wait. No Place for Bravery. So I've been trying to play more things as they come out as opposed to waiting and getting them down the road. So I'll have to see. Right now for 2022, that's tough because I didn't play Tunic at launch, but Tunic is technically a 2022 game. And that is pretty high up there for me right now. That might be the front runner, honestly. Although I will say, see, South of the Circle is an interesting one because it came out in 2020 on Apple Arcade. It's ported 2 years later. It's in that category still of like, what do you call that then? A 2020 Game of the Year candidate or a 2022? And I think that gets into the whole like remaster, remakes, updates, ports, etc. on where things rank. So I'm not sure, but definitely the narrative in that is so great, and the way that they use things, like that would put it in that category for me if it's considered, quote unquote, for consideration. But insofar as it has to do with Stray, fantastic game, absolutely worth the price and time. just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And yeah, something that I'm very glad I was able to get to as quickly as I did.